Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I am your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. We have a special episode today. Journalist Katherine Corcoran. You'll remember her from season 1, episode 30. We talked about her book, In the Mouth of the Wolf. If you haven't read it, I don't know what you're waiting for. Trust me, it's awesome. Anyway, Katherine and I had all these conversations after we turned off the recording. We just did a deep dive into what journalism is nowadays and what makes good journalism, what makes bad journalism, and it turned into its own episode. Hope you like it. Let's talk to Kathy. Kathy, thank you so much for coming back.
Thank you for inviting me back. It's fun to be here.
We had our first episode, which was on your book, In the Mouth of the Wolf, which, first of all, I want to say, looks to be absolutely killing it right now. I mean, the reviews were fantastic. I kind of keep an eye on them. How are you feeling about it so far?
I'm really thrilled by the reception because it's a topic I care a lot about.
And it's a great book that is very well deserved. And the last episode, we talked mainly about the book. And then when we stopped recording, you and I just kept talking just about journalism in general, which was kind of our idea to do this episode, right?
Exactly. Yeah, we couldn't stop talking. I think we talked like another hour. So.
It was a solid hour. And it was fantastic. And thank you so much for willing to do, part 2. But I do want to, for the listeners, because this was something that you and I talked about right when that conversation started, is journalism has some issues. One of the things I said to you, and you totally agreed, is this is not a Fox News, MSNBC only problem. There's a lot of journalistic issues that we're dealing with nowadays, right? So for the listeners, if you're listening to hear us bash Fox News, not going to happen. If you want us to bash MSNBC, not going to happen. This is about journalism as a whole and not about calling out any one side of the aisle, so to speak.
Exactly.
So first things first, in case people haven't listened to the last episode, we have to establish how big a deal you are, Kathy. How long have you now been a journalist?
Very long time, 40 years.
I think a lot of people don't even understand. I mean, I know I still feel like I don't, is how journalism works. We had a whole bunch of people sending questions, so I wanted to ask basically 2 parts. The first part, life of a journalist, and how do you even decide on a story or topic? Is it something somebody gives it to you? If you're the bureau chief, you're like, you go look into this? Or is this stuff that just kind of pops into somebody's head and then they decide to go look into it?
It's actually both. One of the important things about being a journalist anywhere is to get out and get to know and understand whatever territory you're covering. And so if you do that, you go out and meet people, you make sources, you write small stories to sort of get yourself, kind of get your feet wet in the topic or the region. And by doing that, that's how you come up with stories, because you start to observe certain things that you have not seen written about anywhere. If you see something like that, you'll go to an editor and pitch a story. Sometimes stories can be more top down. Like at the Associated Press, the international editors are in New York and they're looking at the entire world. And so they might see something in Mexico that has more of a context of, hey, we're interested in this and how it fits into the rest of the world. Or we haven't seen this anywhere else in the world. Could you write about this? But I would say that most of the stories bubble up from the bottom instead of the reverse. And editors always defer to stories that have, not always, but ideally, defer to the stories that bubble up from the bottom, because we believe that our correspondents, they're on the ground, they know that territory best, and they're the ones who see the stories. Whereas an editor is more removed, and sometimes their stories are more conceptual. Sometimes they don't really pan out on the ground. The short answer would be that it's both, that you generate your own stories, but you also get assignments.
Now, when you're watching a movie, the good journalist is always that really pushy person. Is that anywhere close to reality? I mean, you have that person, no, I'm not going to talk, and they're just doggedly chasing after somebody? Or is it about asking the right questions at the right time? What is it?
Well, I would say it's more persistence than pushiness. And again, it depends on the subject. For example, if you're speaking about a public official who's paid by taxpayers and paid to serve the public, then I think pushiness is not out of line because you are representing the public in terms of asking questions and wanting answers. And if a person who is a public official doesn't want to oblige, then I think, yes, that we can be pushy because from our point of view, it's, hey, that's your job. Your job is to answer to the people. But if it's an average person, you really treat average people much differently because most times they didn't ask to be in the limelight. And so you need to give them space and respect if they say no. And if you don't, and you see that too all the time, people who don't, and it makes us look very ugly because it is. In a sort of a third realm, if you're doing an investigation like I did in this book, there were a lot of people who didn't want to talk to me. And so I used the persistence method where I would ask them, and if they said no, I would maybe offer some alternatives, some ways that they might feel safer or more comfortable talking to me. I would send them my stories so they would see what kind of journalist I am. I would explain in great detail what I was doing and why and how I would protect them if they had some concerns. A lot of times you have to let people sit and think about it. But the idea is that you keep going back. And a lot of times if you keep going back and they keep seeing you, they understand that you're serious. You know, you're not just there for one hit.
That was one of the most interesting parts of our last interview is you talked about when you're reaching out to people, when you're trying to create sources, the danger factor. That is something else that Hollywood kind of builds up, that, you know, intrepid reporter going out there and putting them in harm's way. And you made it very clear in the last interview, that's not good journalism, right? If a source is being very clear about not wanting to talk to you, if it's going to put you in danger or somebody else in danger, that there was always discussions about safety first. No one's going to get sent out to get a story if there's a really good chance that something bad's going to happen, right?
Right. I mean, we always want the story, but if there are those kinds of circumstances around safety or security, we have to consider how are we going to get the story. And a lot of times you try to get the story, but you can't because you can't go out there. You still might try maybe from a distance. But again, at some point, it's very much a hit and miss kind of profession. You try, but a lot of times your tries don't hit. And this would be mostly with this kind of longer term stories that we try to tell in the more in-depth or the more investigative kinds of stories, because you do have time to keep going back. But a lot of times they don't hit. Like, first of all, on those kinds of stories, there's a huge premium on trust. Like, person has to trust the journalist. You have to establish that somehow that you are trustworthy and ethical and that you are not going to abuse either the person or the information they give you. Oftentimes, some people want the information to get out. And so sometimes they initiate it. But if you're initiating it, it's much more complicated. And I remember a story I really wanted to do that's related to my book. When I was in Mexico, these newspapers were getting, and TV stations were getting hit all the time. Either their people were being kidnapped or they were being harassed, or sometimes every once in a while they'd be killed. But there were also like bombings outside their offices, or somebody would come by and shoot up the office. I mean, there were all kinds of things like that going on at newspapers. And what I really wanted to do was get inside a newspaper and say, how do you operate when you're literally under fire? Like, what are your editorial meetings like? How do you decide what to cover, not to cover? Because there's this whole other layer of danger and security around the newspaper. And I had a really good friend who did trust me. His newspaper came under attack. And I thought, well, this is the perfect opportunity because he knows me. He knows I'm not going to abuse anything and just let me tell the story because they're journalists. It's like, let us tell the story. And he went to the owners of the newspaper and they just said, absolutely not. So there are a lot of ideas that you have as a journalist that you try to get, and sometimes you just can't be successful because of the circumstances.
And what are those questions? You know, just posing a hypothetical. I'm a cub reporter. Did I use that term right? Cub reporter, like a new guy?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I'm a cub reporter. I come to you and say, I'm working on this thing about, you know, discrepancies at City Hall. I have a source. He seems nice, but he's also a known drug lord. Is that something where somebody's going to go with you? Are you meeting them in public? Is that like a billion different questions? Or is it, hey, do you feel safe about this? Have you checked this? Have you checked that? Like, how in depth is that check with that reporter before you send them out?
It's pretty in depth. Especially now in the United States. It used to not be so much a consideration in the United States, but the environment for the press has changed so much that it has become more dangerous to be a reporter in the United States. Not nearly in the sense that it is in Mexico, but here you can become a target just by identifying yourself as a journalist. And that was something that in my first 30 years of being a reporter, I never even considered. It just didn't happen. And now it happens pretty regularly. I think when somebody comes to you with information and they're maybe not the most reputable person, well, first of all, if you know nothing about them, you have to do some research on the person and what might be the motivation that they're bringing you this information. And then second of all, you have to evaluate the information because it could be very good information. In journalism, you take information from everywhere. A lot of times the bad guys, because the bad guys have a lot of good information. And so you take the information, but you have to evaluate, why is this coming to me? Is there some kind of manipulation involved? And how good is the information? I've taught journalism a lot over my long career. And I always tell students, you know, a lot of students come in with this idea of who's good and who's bad. And I say, you know, just forget all that in terms of politics, morals, anything like that. I say the good people to a journalist are the people who give you good information, are the people that you can trust to be telling you the truth. And it can come from any realm and any circle. And so you have to get rid of those kinds of prejudices if you're going to be a good journalist. You have to look for information in every corner. And then over time, if you continue to work with the same people, you find out who you can trust and who you can't trust. And if you can't trust someone, I mean, me personally, I don't go back to that person. Worse than being a drug lord, I can look at somebody and go, no, they're bad. They gave me bad information. And so it's a very different way of measuring. But if you are meeting with someone who is dangerous, you have to weigh, first of all, if the story is worth going to the source. And if you go to the source, if you decide that it is, then how are you going to go to that person safely? And what kind of security measures are you going to have in place before you do that? We had a situation in Mexico where we were offered an interview with a drug lord. His name was Servando La Tuta Gomez. He's now in jail. At the time, he was in hiding in the mountains in Michoacan, and he was a very publicity-minded capo. And so this message came to us through somebody we didn't know, and he said, we can arrange an interview between one of your journalists and this guy. And a lot of times I would dismiss things like that, but I didn't dismiss that one because I thought that I knew this guy. He had actually done other interviews, and I was like, this guy likes publicity. And I think that maybe we could, you know, put some measures in place where we know that the reporter would be okay. Because again, we'd seen other reporters had actually interviewed him, and he just didn't seem like the kind of guy who he wanted to get his information out. He wasn't going to like kidnap a foreign correspondent. He wanted to get the word out. And then I thought of things like, okay, well, I wouldn't make anyone else go, but I would go because I was willing to take the risk. You know, do things like that where I would say, this feels like it's doable. I don't want to make anyone else who might be uncomfortable, but I'll do it. I want to do it. And so I went to my boss with this idea, and she said, absolutely not. And she said, can we get a Zoom call with
They never let you have any fun, do they?
And so her measure of doing this safely was, let's do it by Zoom. Because then that way we can see him and we know it's really him, as opposed to like doing it over the telephone. And then, of course, that story went nowhere. And so, like I said, you give it a try. And my measure of what in all probability would be safe, her measure was entirely different. And she was the boss, so her word was final. So those are the kinds of conversations. And again, it wasn't necessary for us to talk to this guy. It was kind of a novelty because, drug lords never speak to the press. So the idea of it was a novelty, but it wasn't a necessity. And so again, when you're weighing the kind of information that you need and that you want to give to the public, you have to prioritize, well, what's really necessary here?
Now, the next group of questions, you've actually already touched on a lot of it. It's about sources. You've already covered how do you get sources, how do you vet them, who is most reliable, and how do you kind of go through that. One thing you didn't touch on is if you're verifying facts, how many sources do you need? If you hear something from one source, how do you get to the point where you say, I can now verify that this is something I can write with confidence?
Well, again, that varies by the type of information. So say, for example, you're covering Congress and you're talking to a congressperson who wrote a bill. You can pretty much print what they're saying because they're the author of the bill. But then you also have the bill in front of you to fact check and make sure that what they're saying is correct. In that case, it's pretty straightforward. Or say there's some big police incident and they appoint a spokesperson to give the information to the public and to the press. They're designated as an official. Now, a lot of times we see that officials don't give good information, especially initially, but sometimes when people are wondering what's going on, you have to print what they say according to this official. And then a lot of times you'll see now, like in Uvalde and other places where there have been these huge tragedies, the press will go back in and investigate and see that the initial information was wrong or misleading. But when there's a designated official and it's a breaking news story, the press is going to quote that person and have that person speak live on television and all those kinds of things. And then there's always time later to verify if they were telling the truth or not. So those kinds of things would be like one person sources. If somebody tells you something, you always want to verify it another way. I mean, no matter who it is, like I said, if it's a congressperson talking about a bill, you want to check the bill and make sure they're telling you the right facts. If it's a police source, you want to go in, keep plugging to make sure that what they actually said is the truth, which now is turning out not to be true in a lot of cases. And so it's very rare that if someone's giving you information that you would just straight print it, because you want to verify it. And the best way to verify anything is through a document that will back up what the person is saying. And so that's the thing that you ask first. If somebody tells you, especially if it's kind of an outlandish or, really what we would call a big story, the first question is, how can we verify what this person is saying? And how can we verify it on paper? Where are the documents? So that's what you would go for first. And if those documents don't exist, sometimes, that might be the end of the story. The second way would be, who are the other people who were there or who know something about this, who can verify what this person said? Other witnesses or other people involved in whatever this thing is that's going on. And again, they have to be reputable people. They can't be people on the periphery. They have to be people inside. Like sometimes someone on the periphery will tell you something like, I hear this is going on in this organization or blah, blah, blah. But then, of course, you have to find the direct source in order to be able to print something and think that you're printing the truth or evaluate it as this is what's really going on. So you often start at the periphery and then you kind of work your way in to the people at the center of whatever the controversy is and find somebody there. It's like first person, first hand. We can't print hearsay. We can't say so-and-so said this. It's like you have to go to so-and-so and confirm it or deny it. And if the person denies it, then you can't print it. Now, sometimes you will say, well, that's not true because we do that all the time. Well, that's because we have a way to verify what really happened. And so if the person denies it, we have the counter proof that it really did happen. I mean, this happens all the time. You go, if there's some controversy or some scandal, you go to the person at the center of the scandal and they say, not me, I didn't do it. But then you have a court document that lists all of the charges. And then you say, here's what the court document says. Here's what the official document says. And then the person says, well, it's not true, or it's a political persecution, or whatever they want to say. But you have the official document to back it up. But sometimes if you don't have that and you go to a person and you say, I have this information that says this and this and this, and the person says didn't happen, you're kind of stuck unless you can find another way to verify it. And the initial source says it didn't happen. Sometimes you just have to believe that it didn't happen. And sometimes it didn't happen because we get bad information all the time.
This feels to me, and this is just me saying this out loud, I may be completely wrong. It seems like lately a lot of that is slipping, where, okay, these two people who we're not going to name, which it makes sense that you wouldn't necessarily name everyone in every situation, but this person said this didn't happen. But we have two people who, we can't tell you who they were, but these two people said it did happen. It seems like a lot of journalism lately does get caught in that vice of, well, we got one person saying he said, one person saying she said, and we're just going to report it and kind of see what happens from there, as opposed to kind of what I think you're saying, which is if you can't really verify it, you can't run it. You just have to sit on it and say, I can't prove this. I can't just put this out into the world unless I can actually verify it somehow.
Well, I would agree with you. And I think what's slipping is the use of anonymous sources, because they're just all over the place. And it's never ideal to use an anonymous source. And there are a separate list of rules for how you use an anonymous source at a place like the Associated Press. But first of all, to address what you're saying, I haven't seen this movie yet, She Said, but I think it'll go into a lot. And certainly the books written about the Harvey Weinstein case go into this. They had to create a standard for verifying what the women were saying when the women did not go to the police or did not file a lawsuit. There were no official documents to back up these stories. And if you see in those stories, the newspapers or the media, like the New York Times, would explain to the readers why we think it's okay to print this information. And you'll see the standards that they use. They'll tell you what standards they used in order to publish it. And in these cases, it was the woman went to, at the time it happened, and told the story. I can't remember what the other factors are, but say this story happened 10 years ago. You see this all the time with these stories. The woman told her mother or her sister, and they go to the sister, and the sister tells the same story. And then you ask, well, who else knows about the story? And then you maybe try to get someone who was in the office at the time, or see if the person ran out in distress or anything like that, like witnesses. And then you also want to see if the story changes, because that could be a sign that, maybe it wasn't exactly as it's being told to you, if it evolved over time. And so those kinds of stories are really tricky. And so in that case, the media itself said, we've had to establish a new standard for how to verify these stories, because in so many cases, there are no documents. It is just he said, she said. And so this is when we decide that's verified to say what she said. And another thing that reporters use in that case is that predators are normally like serial predators. They don't just do something once. And so if someone has one story, usually there's 10 or dozens more. And that's what's happened in a lot of these cases, is that as soon as one person had the courage to talk, then other people came out of the woodwork. And then those people describe a very similar method, because usually the MO is the same or very similar. And so that's a way to say, well, maybe you'd have one or two women who wanted to get at some guy and make up a story, but you wouldn't have like 30, and you wouldn't have them over various time frames and in various circumstances. And so there are stories where it's very tricky and you have to be careful. And sometimes the media is criticized also for being too careful. And we look like we're withholding information because it's somebody powerful. And so we kind of get it on both ends, like if we print, we're being careless, but if we don't print, we're covering up for somebody. And as you can tell, this is much more of an art than a science. And you have to weigh so many things, and you have to bring in a lot of voices a lot of times to figure out what's the ethical thing to do and what's the proper thing to do in terms of publishing.
I did read Ronan Farrow's book, Catch and Kill. So from his perspective on the Weinstein case where he was doing the investigating, and you're just reminding me of how much of that book is him talking about, I talked to this person, so then I was ready to run with it, but then the person before that said, I'm now off the record, you can't write what I wrote. And he talked about that back and forth of his kind of push and pull of getting to that point that you're talking about where he can go to his bosses, and then often, whether nefarious or not, the bosses would kind of have a completely different way of looking at it from him about whether or not this story was viable to put out in the world, or whether or not they had to sit on it until more came in.
Exactly. And there's sort of an informal rule that if two people, and I'm talking about something far less sensitive than these stories or the Harvey Weinstein case, but there's pretty much an unwritten rule that if two people say the same thing and they're not related in any way, like it's not like they fed that person the story, that's a likely accurate version of what happened. But in a lot of cases, as you point out in this one, you can't use that two person. And sometimes if it's sensitive, the editor say, I want 3 people, I want 4 people. They'll want more people. But I had a case that I describe in the book where 5 people told me the same story about Regina Martinez getting strange phone calls on her telephone. And by everyday journalism rules, that's more than enough to print a story. But I just, for some reason, there were enough people on the other side telling me, I don't think so. I don't think that happened. And so to the point where I say in the book, it had to do with this telephone she had and what kind of calls were coming in and who was the previous owner of the number. And so finally I decided the only way I'm going to know if this is true is I have to see who the previous owner of the number was. And once I had that information, I had to conclude it wasn't true. Because even though so many people told the same story, in reporting for a newspaper or whatever, you can't put that whole process in. But in a book, you can. And I put it in there just to show people how deceptive things can get or how rumors can become fact and how difficult it is sometimes to know what is the truth and what isn't.
Information like that, one of the questions we had is that one of the stories that you would say where it was more difficult to get information? I know I'm in the DC area, work in the federal government, so we talk about how FOIA requests are supposed to work and they're supposed to be easy to get information. Can you think of any particular story that it was just really hard to get information that you're like, this is the hardest I've ever had to work to get information on something?
Well, I would say it had to do with the story in the book because there are a lot of human rights violation allegations against the officials in the state where this story occurred. And there are allegations of forced disappearances and other kinds of human rights violations against public officials. And so that raises it to like a UN international violation. There's international rules that cover governments that are committing human rights abuses. So there were several cases against several of these officials alleging human rights violations. And in Mexico, court documents are not public until the case is completely adjudicated, except in the case of human rights violations. The law says that if the case involves in human rights violations, there has to be a public version of the case made, even if it's in process. And so I and other people filed freedom of information requests. Actually, Mexico has very strong freedom of information, transparency laws. They don't call it freedom of information. That's a U.S. term, but they call it transparency. And so they have strong transparency laws. And so we filed for these cases. And to this day, the prosecutors in that state, the state attorney general, will not release those cases in clear violation of the law. And the appeals even went to they have a national commission for transparency who makes rulings. And even the National Commission said those are public documents. You have to make public versions of those cases. They can redact some things, but to this day, none of those cases have been released, in clear violation of the law. And so the next step, somebody would have to get a lawyer and file a lawsuit to get those documents released, because the government itself is in violation of its own laws. And I think you'll find a lot of cases like that. Well, definitely in Mexico, but around the world, but also more and more in the United States. It's getting harder and harder to get information through Freedom of Information requests. There are a lot of big stories about where the basis of the story is leaked documents, because the documents aren't publicly available, or they're not, like the whole Donald Trump tax returns, or what they called the Panama Papers about all the people hiding money in tax shelters offshore. And I mean, just the zillions and zillions of documents that have been released because they're not available publicly. And then sometimes they're supposed to be available publicly, but the entity will use some kind of trumped up reason why they can't be released.
And now this touches a lot. When you're talking about FOIA, you are talking about privacy. Some of the questions we had basically boiled down to, how do you protect the privacy of a source? And also, how do you protect your own privacy? Which I think is probably even more complicated, because you're a journalist. You want people to be able to get in touch with you, but you don't want them to know too much about you. So how do you protect the privacy of sources and yourself when you're doing something like you did for the book, where it can get a little weird, little touchy? You want to be safe?
Well, there are various methods that you can use to get in touch with people. Obviously, encrypted methods of communication. As I've mentioned, I would offer people a ticket or the ability to get out of where they were and go to a neutral place where nobody knew who they were, wouldn't recognize them, where it would be safer for them to talk. There are a lot of ways to do that. It's interesting because I haven't reported in the United States for a long time, but I understand that online harassment of journalists now is really terrible, especially women journalists, because they get a lot of threats of sexual violence. Working in Mexico as a foreign correspondent or an international journalist, you don't tend to get those kinds of attacks that the local journalists do. They tend to be very local. Those kinds of attacks are very regional, or very, like if you're a national correspondent for the New York Times or the Washington Post, then you would get it maybe nationally from whoever read your stories. But I didn't really get the sense that there was any gain in harassing foreign journalists. And so it's not something I ever experienced here nor there. But I know it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem, especially for younger journalists now in the profession, that it's something they have to consider all the time.
Well, and I think you mentioned before, being an international journalist in Mexico specifically, because that's where you were, you almost started off safer, because people who are going to cause problems, it's not worth it to do something to somebody from a different country, because it becomes a much bigger deal than it's worth, whereas messing around with locals didn't carry as much problems if something went wrong, right?
Exactly.
I would recommend that the safest way is just never go on Twitter. If you just don't go on Twitter, I think everything will be fine.
Some journalists will post things, or organizations will post things, and they'll turn off the comments. That's one way. Sometimes journalists will have their professional social media accounts separate from their personal social media accounts, or they won't have anything personal on social media at all. Like you said, you still want to be available. So you give people different ways to get in touch with you, like maybe more discreet ways to get in touch with. A lot of times they'll just say DM me, or, DMs are open, so they can get any DM from anyone. But then again, those kinds of like threatening things can come in. But it is a difficult line to walk, because as a reporter, and this would be, again, me in my younger years, I wanted everybody to know who I was. And I wanted to hand my cards out to everybody. You never know when someone's just going to spontaneously call you with something really important. And then it was a little bit shocking to me the first time I went to Mexico, and people said, never give out your business card. And I was like, wow, really? That's like completely opposite of what I normally do. And you just have to find other ways to sort of get out there.
And what did they just didn't want your phone number out there? Why would they say in Mexico, do not hand out your business card? Did it make you look unprofessional? Was it just way too easy to get in touch with you? What was their kind of thinking beyond that?
I haven't heard so much about this lately, but at the time there were a lot of kidnapping hoaxes and extortions that people would do if they had your phone number. It was sort of an anti-crime thing where if you had your phone number out there, you were vulnerable to a lot of extortions or scams or people calling you and saying, we've got your family member. That was one of the first reasons they told us not to give out our phone numbers. And again, just because the environment was so much more dangerous for journalists at the time, you didn't want to give out your address. You didn't want anyone to know where you were, where you worked, or where you lived. That's what business cards have. They have your phone number and your address. And so they're like, no, don't give that to random people. Only give it to people you trust.
You said something that sticks into my head, right? Where you're saying, I started years ago. Things have changed a lot. It's got to be crazy to think back when you first started that you'd have to go to all of these different places to get pieces of paper, to do research, to do all of those things. I mean, on a much less professional level, I remember having to go to the library to look up things. You used to have to go places to get any sort of information, and now you can do so much from a laptop. Do you ever stop to think about how many miles you would have put on the car back in the day to do what you do nowadays?
Yeah, I think the thing that really surprises me is how fast we were back in the day without all these stuff, because we still wrote stories every day and we still verified things. I would say what we used back in the day, we had directories in the newsroom. Like to find people, they weren't online, but they were in print. You could find people, you could do reverse directories. I remember we used those a lot. But we all had in-house libraries. So we had people who were there to take our questions and look them up. We also had clip files, which again was very cumbersome, but it was a way to see what had been written in the past about whatever you were writing about. So like if you got an assignment in the morning, the first thing you did was call the library and ask for the clip files, and they'd bring them to your desk and you could rifle through them as quickly as you would, looking at a scroll of stories online to get a gist of where the story was at that moment. And so it always surprises me how quickly we did our jobs without all this stuff. There were always computers. I never worked before computers, not quite that old. And we had fax machines and we had teletype machines, which was the old AP machines that, would print the news on a big roll. And the AP in the old days was very much considered one way to verify information. I mean, we always had to verify it for ourselves, but also it was considered a very reliable source of basic information that would come over the teletype. So there were still a lot of ways that the information was coming in. I would like to say one comment about how media and journalism's changed so dramatically in a negative way is the impact of all these cutbacks. People say, oh, reporters are cutting corners and getting sloppy. And in some ways that could be true. But I think the bigger tragedy is that there aren't enough reporters and that the journalists who are there are being piled with more and more stuff to do. And so if you don't have time to devote, I'm not going to say the quality will go down. It's not like you're necessarily going to print false information, but you're just going to do such a lighter treatment of whatever's going on. And I think that's a real tragedy because it is diluting the quality of journalism and information that people are receiving. And also, without journalists to be out in the field, if there are fewer and fewer journalists who have to do more and more stories, you're sitting at your desk all day and just writing stories from your desk. And if you don't go out in the field and meet people and get to know people, there isn't that trust. And a result now, especially with all this negative stuff about, the media is bad, the media is this, the media is that. If a reporter calls you, people don't want to call you back because they don't know who you are. And you hear all this terrible stuff about reporters and journalists and how, we're just out to get people and we are write fake news and whatever you want to hear. Why would you call a random reporter back? And in the old days, I would call people who knew me because I was out there and I'd go to all these little meetings that they had, and I would go to the city council and all that stuff that doesn't really get covered anymore. And so if I called somebody, they already knew who I was and they knew what kind of stories I wrote. And of course, some people didn't like me, so they'd say, no, I'm not going to talk to her. But it was like that contact that really gave you your trust and legitimacy and your relationship with the community. Like, journalism is for the community. And you would hear directly from the community, oh, we didn't like that. Or, oh, well, that was good, but why don't you look into this? And this was before the internet. I felt such a greater connection to my audience before the internet than I do now. In the old days, people would actually sit down and write you letters, or they would pick up the phone and they would call you and they would say, I have a problem with that story you wrote. Or they would say, oh, I love that story. How about this? Why don't you look into this? And when I would go out into the community, especially when I worked for the San Jose Mercury News, and I would say, I'm from the San Jose Mercury News, people would say, great newspaper. I never worked for an organization where I got so much positive feedback when I said, I'm a journalist and I work for the San Jose Mercury News. And so it gave us this feeling of like real connection with the community. And I think in so many places that doesn't exist anymore. And that's one of the problems. And that's why it's so easy for people to say journalists are bad people, because there's not that connection that I lived in my career.
Question 1, how could someone not like you? In fact, don't even answer that. People are stupid. We're not going to spend any time on it. My own editorializing on this from, my very small view out into the world. If there aren't enough reporters, I'd also say the second real problem that I notice nowadays is urgency. That there is such a rush to report something that it almost seems more and more acceptable to be wrong, but you got out there first with it. Just for instance, Uvalde, we already brought that up. I remember hearing about it and I just said, this is horrific, but I'm waiting 24 hours before I read a story. Because if you try and read the ticker of this stuff coming out, there's so much that's reported wrong, and you wait a little bit and you find out, wow, like a very good amount of that was just completely wrong because they were just reporting what they heard. They aren't checking anything. Am I wrong? Is that something that you're seeing from your perch, right? Somebody who's done this for years. Is there a real push on urgency nowadays, and that's leading to some more slip-ups?
I think that's probably true. I can only say from my perspective that I worked for a news agency that has to be first. They've always had to be first, even before the internet. The AP was created as a co-op for other media. So the media bought memberships to the AP because they wanted good information and they wanted it fast. And that's what the AP started out as. And now every media company is like the AP. They're all on the internet 24/7, and they've got to get it first, and they've got to put up their stories. And so I worked for the organization that did that before anybody else did. So we had guidelines and we had ways to avoid the mistakes, the initial mistakes. I mean, we still made them. I mean, we wrote stories in Mexico on breaking news where we trusted the government was just completely wrong. But once you make that mistake, the idea is you don't do it again.
Have you ever had to issue a retraction for something you wrote?
I had a bad correction once at the AP for something that I wrote. We don't edit quotes in the sense that we don't change what people say. But if somebody says something really long, we'll take sections of it out and indicate that there was a section taken out to try to get the gist of the quote. And by taking out certain parts of the quote, the person who said it basically said, I changed the meaning of what they said. And my editors agreed with me. And so we had to run a correction. And like I said, those are very painful things to have to endure.
Does it kind of come with the territory? You kind of expect sooner or later something like that will happen, that somebody will disagree with the way you wrote something up? Or was that mortifying for you where you're like, I am upset that this is going on right now?
Oh, no, it's mortifying. When I worked for the San Jose Mercury News, one of the things that I always prided myself on is that there were so few, if any, corrections on my stories. And so I would tell people if they wanted to know how accurate I was, I would say, Google Katherine Corcoran and correction and see what comes up, because I was like so proud of that. So of course that was the standard I took to the AP as well. And so if I had to do a correction, it was horrible. It was mortifying. And in fact, I remember we had a bureau chief meeting where one of the assistant editors said, Kathy, do you want to explain to all of us what happened? In front of all my peers, she called me out and said, tell us what went wrong. So they made it very, very painful for you.
Now, my question for this, when a correspondent screwed up, what kind of angry boss were you? Were you the cool, calm, angry boss, or were you the ranting and raving boss?
Again, in the old days, everybody was a ranting and raving boss. And that stereotype of the editor screaming and calling the reporter an idiot, that's actually true. That happened a lot. In modern professional settings, you don't really do that anymore. Instead of reacting, you have to problem solve. You have to figure out what happened and how do we make sure it doesn't happen again. The best way you can do that is to approach the reporter and say, what happened? And get the download first so you can evaluate the information and then say, oh, well, that really wasn't a good thing to do and we can't be doing that. And if it happens really more than once, then we start thinking about replacing the person.
Did you ever have to deal with a plagiarist, somebody who's just straight copying somebody else's work?
No, not on any of my teams. I was plagiarized a couple times, and I would just go to the editor and say, look at this, and then they would handle it because it really wasn't my place. In fact, I got plagiarized at the San Jose Mercury News, and it turned out it was the person who did it was a very young reporter. And I gave it to my editors, and they said, we'll handle it, because personnel things are private. You can't say what happened to the person or how they were disciplined. So I never knew what happened to the reporter, but I did feel a little bit bad because at least we heard that they came down like a ton of bricks, but I wouldn't let that go. I mean, if someone plagiarized me, I would never let that go.
And that reporter's name was Brian Williams. I'm just kidding, everyone. That is a joke. Do not report that anywhere. Well, we're talking about the state of the media, and everything that we've kind of talked about is, as you said, this is not a science, it's an art. And one of the stories that I told you when we discussed this offline over the last episode was in the Army, I was taught that, hey, journalists are going to be around, right? We're going to be in Iraq. There's going to be journalists. And I was hoping that this wouldn't insult you, but I wanted to tell you this story where I was taught that journalists have a job to do, but they are not professionals, because the definition of professionals is there needs to be some sort of independent body that decides the rules for the profession. For the military, it's the Uniform Code of Military Justice, where, like you're saying, if you're at AP, it could be totally different what rules you're using as opposed to CNN, right? Or, Fox News, anything like that, where depending on who's in the room, who's in charge and things like that, there's no hard and fast rules, as you've mentioned. Is that becoming a bigger problem for the media nowadays because people are playing by different rules? Was it always something that you were fighting against? Is it getting worse? What do you think?
There are basic standards across the profession. You're right that there's no independent body that actually guards or keeps track of those. Just for that reason, I just looked up the meaning of professional. And it says characterized by or conforming to the technical or ethical standards of a profession. That's the standard definition. And by that definition, we are professionals because we do have technical and ethical standards. And it's up to each organization what those are. But in order to be considered a journalist or journalism, you have to adhere to universal basic standards. And that is, number one, you're printing the truth. And number two, these are the standards by which we measure the truth before we deem it printable or that we can diffuse this information. If you look at the AP ethics and standards, it's pages and pages. If you look at the style book, the AP style book, it also tells you how we make decisions about how to use certain words or certain titles. And often there's ethical reasons behind that. And so then each organization has its own set of ethics and standards, but they all have a base to them, a commonality. I think because there isn't a professional group that polices journalists, that we need to be transparent about how we do our jobs. And you can look all of those things up online, like what are the guidelines for the New York Times or for the Associated Press. And I think that media, because of all the attacks we're under in terms of being fake news or whatever, that you see it actually more than you used to, where a medium will put out, this is how we did the story, or this is why we decided to print this information, or they'll explain their ethical standards in a story. I mean, I think there could be much more of it, but I think that for us as journalists, transparency is key because we expect other people to be transparent.
I think my frustrations when I think about journalism nowadays, I think fake news it's a dumb term. I honestly don't look at a lot of these larger organizations, talking about CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, all of them. I don't think they're lying to me. I don't think they're saying something is a fact and it's not a fact. But what I do notice, because I will take a story and I feel like if you don't look at least 3 sources that's reporting on the same story, you don't really know what's going on. I'll notice very significant differences in word choice about the same story, the focus of that same story, facts that are deleted from it. And I feel like that's the bigger problem. When people say fake news, I think they roll all that into it, which is if I go to a liberal website, no matter what a Republican says, it's going to be evil and awful. And if I go to, a right-leaning website, it's going to be the opposite for a Democrat and things like that. Which your ethical standards, right, wouldn't necessarily say something like that. That becomes a choice by the journalist, by the editor of if there's a slant, but we're still telling the truth. Is that something that you have to take into account? Do those conversations happen, or is it completely by the organization, how they choose, how they present the news to people?
Well, I would say if somebody's reporting a story with a bias toward one political side, then that's not a journalistic organization, or it's a journalistic organization that has a bent to it that is often stated. Like there is left-wing media that will say that's what they are, and so you kind of would expect that perspective from them. I would say what they call the mainstream media, the intent is not to do that. And if people feel like we're doing it, we get called on it. And actually now we're being criticized for this both sidism, because that was our way of balancing a story, was getting both sides. And with all the complications now in information, it's not working as well as it used to. And we do need a new method for digging, getting to the balance or the truth. But I think that there are a lot of organizations that put out information where you really have to weigh who they are and what their purpose is. There are certain publications where I'll look at them and I'll know what they're going to say about an issue, even though they're using facts. So we get criticized for being biased, but that's actually what we're trying not to do. And then we're also being criticized for both sidism. For example, like climate change is something where I think mainstream media coverage has changed quite a bit, because we were doing the both sidism, like, well, here's the climate change deniers and here's the climate change, doomsayers. And we always went to both sides. And it turned out not really to be helpful. And so what's happened is there are certain accepted facts about climate change that it is happening. And the term changed even from global warming to climate change because global warming became so politically charged. So what's happening now is reporters reporting on climate change are using scientific facts and saying, yes, temperatures have gone up. Yes, this. We have theories on why. We don't know why. We don't know if this is like an every 3,000 year occurrence or whatever it is. I'm terrible at climate change. I'm not an expert at all. But there are certain facts that we can say are facts. And the fact is there is climate change, period. So there's no need to go to the deniers anymore for balance because we're basing what we say in scientific fact. You may disagree on why it's happening, but there is climate change. And the other thing too is that because it's very complicated, it's science, all the major media organizations, including the AP now, have created specific desks with people with expertise to write about it. And not just send some poor reporter like me to some meeting and talk to the person who says, yes, there's climate change. And the person says, no, there's not. So the media does respond in ways like that to provide information that's more valuable and more intelligent. So we do listen and change and always try to do better. Those are the good news kinds of things. And again, I think if you're reading a publication that has a bent to it, that's not journalism. It's kind of like opinion or opinion making. Like, I'll tell you, this is something that nobody knows.
Oh, I can't wait. We're getting exclusive here.
Okay, so when I was bureau chief at the Associated Press, I looked at all kinds of news sources all day long, just to see what else they were reporting, or if we were on a story to see what they were saying, were the facts different, et cetera, et cetera. But when you're in a region as a journalist, you know your region and you know what makes sense. You know what's fake news. I mean, obviously you have to verify, but like, you know, things that just don't make sense. And so I would say that CNN, outside of the TV news and the Don Lemons and whoever else are giving their opinions, CNN has a news service, just like the AP, where they go out and write stories and put them on their website. And so does Fox News. Outside of all whatever stuff you're listening to at night, Hannity and all that, Fox News has a news service. Now, this may have changed. I don't know, because I don't really look at Fox News like I did back in the day. But when I looked at the Fox News news feed and the CNN news feed, they were the same as what the AP was reporting. They were just regular old news services with reporters going out and writing stories. There was nothing political about any of it. And people don't know that because, you know, you see a story that says Fox News and you go, oh my God, that's going to be or you see CNN and you're going to go, oh, that's going to be something else. And you know, I consider myself an expert in that moment. And Fox, there was a service called Fox Latino that covered Latin America. Same stuff everybody else was reporting. They weren't reporting stories saying that immigration was bad. They were just reporting the facts. And so people don't understand that, you know, that's news. And then what you hear at nighttime with all the pundits and all, that's a whole other thing. But people confuse it and they say, oh, well, that's journalism. That's not journalism. But if you look at the journalism that Fox News and CNN were doing day to day to day, it was, in my opinion, very balanced and accurate.
Oh, people are going to write you off for that one. I'll tell you what. And I do know what you're talking about, too, is there's two different parts of all of these news organizations, right? There's those. They're kind of shorter and they're kind of bite-sized where they're very focused on one specific thing, and here it is. And then, of course, you have your headlines, which a lot of times I'll see the headlines, just they're all over the place, very charged and things like that. I'm not going to ask you to name them on here. I'm going to ask you as soon as we shut this off, but I don't want to get too specific. When you're reading your news, how many sources are you going to on a daily basis? Do you have one that's kind of old, reliable, and you go to this one? And then if something seems weird, you might check a couple others. Are you reading all over the place all the time? How do you get your news?
Well, I read the AP. The AP has a fabulous app. It's not so new anymore, but in the old days, as I mentioned, you could only get the AP through another media organization because the subscribers would print AP news. But now with the internet, you can get it directly. And that's relatively new for an organization that's 150 years old. And then you kind of set the app at what you want. You can have your news in English or Spanish. You can have certain regions or certain states, and you can have alerts, and you get AP news. And I work there, and I very much trust the journalists there. And a lot of time, and the journalists often are ahead of everyone else. And then always look at the New York Times and the Washington Post. And I look at my local newspaper and I listen to NPR when I'm in the car. So I would say probably my sources are very traditional, but also I'm on social media. So some article will come into my feed that I won't see through these other means. But like, for example, there was something the other day that was all over, I think it was all over Twitter, that was very disturbing. And it said that in Iran, they were killing the protesters that they had arrested. And there was like reference after reference. And I don't know, you always have those articles that sort of look like news. And it was so horrific. I thought, I wonder if this is fake news. And it could be fomented by, some pro-protester people who are trying to get more urgency for what's going on inside the country. But it was so horrific. And also, I wasn't seeing it, in the mainstream media. And so I decided, I don't know if I believe that. And then it came out a few days later that it was a fake news campaign, that there was like no verification that was actually happening. And if I do see a story that seems interesting and I'm just on social media, I always go up to see, well, who's saying this? And if it's some, global news today or whatever, something you've never heard of, then you have to take it with a grain of salt and you have to say, I'm not sure if this is correct. And then you have to Google, what is this organization? What do they do? Who's behind it? Look at who we are on their webpage. That's what reporters do when they see something. It's like, okay, we have to see if this is coming from a reputable source or not. And so as a reader, if I find something I find particularly interesting and it's not from a source I know, and I have the time, I will dig in and say, well, what is this source? But I'm very skeptical. I'm a very skeptical reader, and I think that everybody should be, because there's so many sources that sort of make themselves look like news.
Kathy, I'd like to end on this question.
Okay.
If you could have an honest conversation that someone was going to listen and they're like, I don't trust the mainstream media. I don't trust the ones we talked about. I don't trust them. I think they are fake news. And they gave you the chance to respond without trying to shout you down. What would you say to somebody who says, I don't trust services like that. I refuse to get my news from there? What would you say?
I would answer with a question. The first question, and I do say this when people tell me that the media is biased, I say, okay, well, where do you get your information? What information do you trust? And I think once the person tells me what information they trust, and then I can say, well, why do you trust it? How do you evaluate for your own mind that happens to be true or that organization is trustworthy? Then I think the conversation can go from there, because there are so many misconceptions and there are so many different types of news sources. And so when someone says that to me, I always engage them in a conversation, and I want to know, because I want to know, as a member of the media and as a journalist, I want to know what people are thinking, and I want to know about the mistakes, or I want to know what the criticisms are. And so I had a conversation once with a woman I know who said, oh, the media is so biased. And I said, well, what media are you talking about? And it turned out that she was talking about MSNBC and Fox News. And she said, well, you'll think this is really weird, but my boyfriend gets his news, because he thinks the media is so biased, he gets his news from Al Jazeera and the BBC. And I think she thought that was strange because they're two foreign news agencies. And of course, everyone thinks Al Jazeera is Al Qaeda or something like that. And I said to her, those are two excellent sources of news. And somehow they thought that was weird, that they were looking at Al Jazeera and the BBC. And I was like, no, I was like, both are fantastic sources of news. And I said, and the other thing that's interesting, if you're going to foreign news agencies, you get an interesting perspective from an agency that's covering a country that's not their own. And I think they're actually more critical and more balanced, because they don't have an axe to grind. They don't have a dog in the fight, So, for example, people always talk about how the BBC interviews are so much better and harder hitting of people like Donald Trump or various politicians in the United States, because you get a different perspective from an outside agency. And I think that's actually can be a very good thing. So that's why I would ask questions, because here's one person thinking it was weird to look at the BBC and Al Jazeera, and Al Jazeera does great stuff, and so does the BBC. Inside of the United Kingdom, you will hear people bashing the BBC all the time, just like they bash the New York Times. I think it's more of a discussion and more of an analysis of where do we get our news? Why do we trust it? How do we get the information that gets us through our day?
Kathy, thank you so much. We're going to have you back. You just don't know it yet.
Okay. All righty. Take care.
And that's it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Katherine, for coming on. Always awesome to talk to her. In the meantime, nerds, hit us up: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Leave comments, leave reviews, leave 5-star ratings. All of that helps. Thanks for listening. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.